Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 5, a Bourdieu'dian analysis for the construction of an education in tea. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny and Ryan Ahn. Hello, Pat. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, Jason.
Hello.
My first question. What in this chapter led you to do your own research? Let's start with you, Pat.
Yeah, for me, it was really a section where you start breaking down, I would say, the Kantian philosophy juxtaposed against the philosophy of Bourdieu. It really got me thinking. Earlier on in the book, in chapter 3, you start elaborating on Kantian philosophy, wondering why you set the book up with Kantian philosophy and then moved to Bourdieu. Was there a reason for that, Jason?
There is a reason for that. Beyond Kant being an older and more established philosopher, Kantian philosophy, particularly in related to aesthetics and preferences, is much more obvious. Kant states that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that individuals can each come to their own conclusions and their own preferences, and that they like what they know. Much later than that, Pierre Bourdieu began writing and said, actually, that's not correct. Anyone can prefer anything. The question isn't what do you like, it's who likes what, and where do those preferences come from? What is the acquisition of those? What is the mechanism of the acquisition of those preferences? And it's actually a much more fruitful question because preferences are enculturated. Individuals begin to learn about their world from their environment, from their peers. And because preferences, are a form of distinction, because they're a form of making a separation between what is good and what is bad, particularly amongst very similar things in very similar categories. For example, in music, individuals who claim to love the opera, right, are making a claim about themselves. And so being able to make a classification, a distinction, it classifies the classifier. The individual doing it might be doing it for reasons of showing cultural capital, or it might be doing it for showing reasons of economic capital. Going to the ballet or going to the opera frequently is expensive. And so moving from the much more obvious Kantian philosophy of aesthetics into this Bourdieu'dian analysis of tea and the construction of tea ceremony, the construction of preferences, and what is tea, what is good in tea, and how do we propagate a praxis if there's no agreement on it, is the idea behind the flow of the book, which sets us up quite nicely for the next question, which was, what did you think was missing from this chapter?
One of the things that I thought was missing is to have this framework being more contextualized with both historical and contemporary examples of preference acquisition in Chinese tea. I'm assuming it's coming in the next sections, but after reading it, I certainly wanted more when it came to making this framework more tangible.
Do you have any examples of new or old preference acquisitions, or the way that preference acquisition is changing?
Sure. So the one that immediately comes to mind in the early 90s and mid 90s, the explosion in popularity of high mountain oolong in Taiwan, where everything got greener and greener and greener as they moved up to new mountains. And then you also start to see actual technology and processing shifts happen, where now you can wither in a refrigerator in a very cold environment, and you can actually look at the leaves and look at the differences of ones that were processed that way and ones that were withered a little more naturally, which are typically a little more red versus that perfect green color. As more people moved into the market and wanted to purchase high mountain oolong, especially from Taiwan, one of those indicators that people were looking for were these super green profiles. That's one that I can immediately think of.
That is a flavor preference. Are we calling flavor preferences aesthetic preferences?
I think we can bridge it to aesthetic preferences, following along the same thread. When I think of Anqi Tieguanyin going from the late 80s all the way throughout the early 2000s, and even still to today, we definitely still see this nuclear green Anqi Tieguanyin, which is the kind of mainstream, easily accessible version of the tea, right? You can still find good versions that are processed to have a little bit of oxidation, have depth of flavor, but you know, definitely the color of the tea, both the infusion and the leaves themselves, there was a high demand to have a very perfect visual experience with the tea, so that Chinese consumers, especially Chinese consumers with money in the late 90s, early 2000s, were looking for these perfectly green, shockingly green Tieguanyins. And I think that was more of an aesthetic preference than actually a flavor preference.
And what was that method of acquisition? Where did they learn to acquire the preferences for something that was vibrant and green?
Take a little stab. I think when we look at some cultural symbology, right, there's things like jade, right, which has a lot of cultural weight to it. So potentially the color of jade or green jade. Additionally, green tea, I think, is something that was, consumed very widely throughout China. And so having an oolong that's very similar in both color and flavor profile to some extent, as green tea might have been something that's really easy to pick up for the average Chinese consumer. Potentially also, as far as pairing with cuisine goes, this really shockingly bright nuclear green Tieguanyin. It's very light, easy to drink, very floral and bright. I think it's something that's cooling in really hot weather, and it's something that can kind of go with, very greasy food, but it can almost stand up to spicy food as well. So there's a couple different things culturally where I think it might have fit in. I think there's some also economic signaling there, though, that this is the new trend. This is what's going on. I can afford to buy this. And hey, here it is. I've bought it. So I obviously have some kind of cachet.
That is exactly what happened with Jinjinmei, is it not?
Yeah, that definitely is around 2007, 8. Jinjinmei just took off, and suddenly this tea that was totally affordable is now, looking at like Longjing prices for just a wee black tea.
Switching gears a little bit, this chapter talks a lot about social signaling and capital, particularly the three different types of capital: economic capital, cultural capital, and social capital. One of the primary ideas is that those forms of capital represent real value, that they can be exchanged between themselves, and that individual status-seeking behavior for showing displays of capital shouldn't be viewed overtly negatively, right? Individuals showing off or partaking in gaudy displays that might be uncouth or less socially acceptable, right? It actually might be a sign of low capital or just low social skills. But these types of capitals contain real value. So where do we see capital acquired and deployed in Chinese tea, in contemporary Western practice? So we'll start with economic, and then we'll do cultural and social. But if each of you want to come up with one or two ideas of where we see it acquired and deployed, I think that would be very interesting.
For better or for worse, I think pu'er collecting has become a bit of economic, capital signaling in some ways. I think a lot of Westerners, have come to enjoy, of course, the flavor profile of pu'er. Just showing off our giant pu'er collections is definitely not the only reason we bought them, but I think to some degree, especially on some of the platforms that are very visually heavy, like Instagram, showing off your economic capital. That hey, I have all these, early '90s green mark cakes. I have lots of like '60s, '70s loose leaf sheng. To now maybe modern Laobanjiang or Naka, famous mountains, showing off all these gushu cakes. I think to some degree there's a lot of economic capital involved, and then signaling of that capital heavily in the pu'er tea community.
I do prefer my Yixing's Qing Dai, so but perhaps those are less gaudy or less immediately identifiable.
I think you got a lot of people right now who are really trying to show off their ROC ones. So you can just one up them, Jason, with your economic capital swing right there.
If it has a Zhongguo Yixing chop at the bottom, it's sorry.
Well, you have a point there, right? Like F1 pots, the past couple of years have really taken off. It's something you could really readily find a decade ago, right? When I started practicing tea. You were a couple of years before that, Jason. But now it's not like you can't find them, but the prices have just gone up and up and up, substantially over the past decade.
Is anyone acquiring economic capital via tea?
In the Western world, probably not. Both on vendor and dealer side, as well as educators. I would not say that there's a lot of economic capital creation, at least not yet.
So it's the same as wine. How do you make a small fortune in wine? You start with a large fortune.
Yeah, yeah. Although the barrier to entry is probably a bit lower.
What about cultural capital? Where do we see cultural capital gained and where do we see it deployed? I think that this is a much harder question than economic capital.
Cultural capital has to be gained through experience, firsthand experiences and learning through others and demonstrating knowledge. So like, when you go into the nicer tea shops in China, Taiwan, right, you're not necessarily going to be served the best tea right away. And you have to demonstrate your knowledge to even get access, even if you have the economic capital to purchase some teas or to, in some cases, to purchase some wares. Purely because the proprietors of them, or the owners, one, there's very few wares, and the owners have a great deal of appreciation for them, and they're not willing to necessarily just sell them to anyone.
What are other forms of gaining cultural capital? There's the experience, the embodied cultural capital, but what about the display, the objectified cultural capital, right? You're talking about the embodied experience, the understanding of the world, the exposure, but the objectified cultural capital, which can then be spent somewhere. So we would say that some of the bloggers with larger readership, if they say this tea is good, or if they say this is the right teapot for this type of tea, that might change individuals' practices, right? Is that cultural capital or is that social capital?
I would say that to some degree, it's certainly cultural capital. There's an effect that's been coined, like the blogger effect, where when a blogger, would review a tea and say, hey, I really like this tea, or I think it's a great price to quality ratio. Suddenly that tea sells out and then it restocks and then it's twice the price. So in some ways, that effect is very real, tangible, and has a economic impact, right? So it can be exchanged, right? It's social capital turning into potentially economic capital because they might have gone out and bought, let's say, a tong of this pu'er, right? And now they're sitting on something that just doubled in value because they put out a review that said, this is good, I like it.
Do you think that the activities that we engage in here, promoting this literati form of tea, do you think that we are doing something that builds cultural or social capital, or do you think that we are spending our cultural and social capital right now, given many of these controversial arguments that we engage in versus the primary contemporary practice?
I mean, I guess it depends, right? The future isn't written yet. Maybe we're spending it and digging ourselves into holes, into arguments that will not blossom later. Perhaps we find an audience that likes these ideas and wants to engage in the debate, and we all move forward together, or something in between.
I like that thought. I think it doesn't have to be a singular answer. With some crowds, right, where we might be building our capital, and with some crowds we are quickly depleting it. So, in some ways that determines who our audience will be.
Planting seeds to spend it all.
Right to the moon.
So social capital, same question. Where do people gain and spend social capital in contemporary practice, in contemporary Chinese tea practice?
So this would be closer to like guanxi and those types of connections where you can lean on your status or your relationships to get access to things, whether it be wares or tea, in a much more direct way.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think, Jason, you're trying to tie to this before with bloggers, but right, blogging is certainly a form of building your social capital, putting out there into the world that, hey, I know something about this topic and I want to share it with the world. Hopefully I can educate the beginners. Hopefully I'll start some conversation with people who are at a higher level. And by putting yourself out there and marketing yourself, you're starting to build this capital, which hopefully you can spend by getting closer connections with, higher level practitioners to then have access to higher level wares or teas, which will then build your other forms of capital. So blogging is definitely one of the ones that I can think of more directly. Jason or Ryan, are there other examples that you have in mind?
Starting small research institutes.
That's just a little one.
A lot of the online content too. People who are very active Instagrams, do live feeds on YouTube and Instagram. Certainly are building up social capital.
I think it's interesting to think of it from the vendor perspective, right? Because as you mentioned, Ryan, Instagram, and we've talked about before, education as marketing. Those are certainly forms of social capital where they build the goodwill around their brand. And over time, right, that might convert non-buyers into buyers, and it might cause people who are customers to want to buy more, right? Because they like the person who's the vendor, or they like the product they make. I certainly have some vendor friends that every now and then I just want to support, right? So I decide, okay, I'll just buy a cake, even though maybe this isn't really what I budgeted for this year, but I would like to help them out. Whether it's actually help or not, I don't know, but hey, let me buy 2 cakes just to show my support.
Education and marketing brings us to our final topic, which is education. This chapter is about actually the construction of an education in tea, what's required to have the experience in order to gain the intrinsic motivation in order to progress the praxis. So my question to each of you is, what do you think the most important components in an education of tea are? And what do you think that, Pierre, how do you think using this Bourdieu'dian analysis framework we can imbue new practitioners with, for lack of a better word, the right preferences?
So I guess I'll start. And I guess my answer would be a little biased because this is my work day to day, but I think the far most important thing for anyone just starting off is learning how to taste, because everything you work backwards from there. So if we lead on your approach, Jason, of what you laid out earlier, the framework of utility, structural functionalism, and then aesthetics, you really should learn them in that order. And if you're a bad brewer, no matter how beautiful your setup is or how good you are performing, you're creating an experience that's going to be awful for the recipient. So learning how to taste and then learning how to brew, I think is foundational. And one of the interesting things is that when we go to external tea groups and visit other people, there's not necessarily a whole lot of attention paid to brewing. But I remember when I first started learning and what we taught at the Institute, we had 5 really bad new brewers, usually in sets of 5, brew the exact same tea. And understanding and watching everyone brew the same tea, same dose, same everything, it's not a pleasant experience because you're drinking a lot of bad tea from people who are not used to brewing it. But you gain the formative experiences to understand what is a good cup and a bad cup, what makes tea balanced or unbalanced or overbrewed and underbrewed. And you repeat that over the course of all of those brews. And by the end of the night, you've had 50 data points in your head about where this tea can go. And then when you compound that over the course of, a semester, you become very good at tasting, and you build up a very good intuition about how to create a cup of tea that has good sensory qualities.
I'm not going to repeat what Ryan said because I think that was a perfect answer. So I'll just kind of add on to his framework: learn how to taste, learn how to brew, and then I think an important one, have the experience of how to make tea. I think actually having the hands-on experience of making tea really solidified a lot of the theoretical knowledge that I had built up about it. And I find that when I talk to individuals who have never had their hands on a tea plant, never done rolling, firing, etc., their knowledge is often very untethered and seems to be very linear or fixed. Once you've processed tea, you realize that it's millions of variables, and that the real gong fu of it, right, all comes down to knowing based on the weather. Did it rain yesterday? How humid is it? The farmer makes these minute choices, and understanding that your longjing from this year, from this village, from this day is different than the next day and the next day. And that even though we might categorize or classify tea into, these little boxes, having the experience of making tea shows you just how meaningful, but also at sometimes how meaningless categorization can be. And so I think it's a good experience to open your eyes a little bit more to the world of tea. So taste, learn how to brew, and then learn how to actually make tea.
We've talked about how F1 Yixings have increased in price, how mid-90s, 98's era pu'er has increased in price. We've talked about the experiences such as going to tea farms and picking and harvesting and processing your own tea. All of these things require economic capital, and the amount of economic capital required is increasing over time. And so one of the points that Bourdieu makes is that type of distinction classifies the classifier, that there are preferences that are gained because individuals have access through economics to social and cultural capital. So one of the questions is, where do we see class distinctions right now at the high end of Chinese tea, right? Not talking about individuals putting tea bags into a Hello Kitty cup, but up at the highest ends of Chinese tea practitioners. Where do we see variations in economic capital? What's a clear indicator, not of knowledge and not of skill, but of just variations in accumulated capital, discretionary income that they can spend on tea?
So I have an example, and it's a story I think the two of you have both heard, but to obtain a tong of Hongyan, for example, you not only need the money, right, but you need a lot of connections. There's only so many tongs of this floating around, and often to even have access to one, it's not even really about the money that you have, but your status. And so we, I think all have heard a story, right, from former tea master, where a general in the People's Republic of China army went to buy a tong of Hongyan, and he had to have it verified, right, by this former teacher of ours. And I think our teacher was put in quite a spot, right, because if the Hongyan is not real, right, if it's not authentic Hongyan, I don't think you want to be on the bad side of someone who just spent a ton of cash and probably burned some social capital when you tell them it's not the real thing. So, certainly to have access to teas like that, right, antique era or masterpiece era, where it requires more than just money, but social connections.
Yeah, I would also include, teaware, antiques and ceramics. And that are not available, and you both need a lot of social capital and economic capital to acquire and to verify that what you have is indeed what it says. So things like ewers from the Tang Dynasty and Song Dynasty, fur hair bowls from the similar period, and there's only a fixed amount of that, and in order for you to have it now, it had to travel a lot of time and space, intact and greatly cared for, there's just not that many of them left.
Perhaps we don't spend enough time with the nouveau rich crowd, but what do you think about things like high fashion brands getting into tea? We know that, say, Louis Vuitton has done custom cases, carry cases for Japanese tea, and even, commissioned bowls to fit into custom cases for outdoor picnic chaji and Japanese tea ceremonies. I believe that we've seen similar things in Chinese tea as well, certain Hong Kong vendors making very high-end travel cases. What are the thoughts on something like that?
Yes, I think Ryan recently shared with me a picture of a Louis Vuitton trunk being used in a Japanese tea ceremony, chakai of some sort. I don't know what temai they're practicing, but man, I hated it. Hot take, but I hated it. I don't think there's anything wrong with you putting what you enjoy from an aesthetic perspective into your tea practice. But I do feel that there has to be some flow, right, between the wares. I feel like all of the items within your table, right, need to speak to each other and need to speak to what you're trying to express. And sometimes you just see, like, I don't know, a baccarat, right, vase, or I think, what was it, a mizusashi that we saw, a baccarat mizusashi. And it just doesn't speak to me when you have a nice raku bowl next to that is, pure crystal mizusashi and Louis Vuitton leather trunk. I don't feel the tie, but on this case, I would lean onto the saying "to each his own," which Jason, I don't think you really enjoy. But Ryan, what's your take on it?
I think it comes down to intention and understanding. So let's say for a second that Tom Sachs sold some of his chawans, and maybe he has, maybe he hasn't, I'm not sure. But let's say those were insanely expensive, which they probably are, if they are available, right? Like, Tom Sachs clearly has a lot of understanding of Chanayu and the whole practice, and has created an original work. And he almost has his own brand, so to speak, at least as far as artists go, this aesthetic. But there the intention is very different. It feels more pure than a high-end luxury house moving into creating a new trunk or a new something to just for the sake of creating it.
Final flash question, sticking on the topic of hot takes. Pat, Louis Vuitton chakai or Tom Sachs chakai? Go.
Tom Sachs, for sure.
Ryan?
Yeah, Tom Sachs.
I mean, let me take off my Louis Vuitton belt and my Gucci shoes before I enter the tea room.
That's a great repurposing of the samurai katana rack. So exactly what is needed.
Yeah, you can't get through the Nijiri Gucci, right? When you're the crawling entrance, if your belt or your gold chain is hanging too low.
The giant GG is just too big on the waist to bend down. So very discomforting. Well, thank you everyone for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for a discussion of the next chapter, The Only Constant is Change.